Hi, I'm Professor Stephen Walker, and I work here in the Department of Physics and Astronomy at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. Here, I do research in a wide range of astrophysics using telescopes such as this one, NASA's Chandra X-ray Observatory. I study the universe on the largest scales, exploring how galaxies cluster together and continue to grow, and the roles that dark matter and dark energy play in shaping the universe that we see. By combining the observations of state-of-the-art simulations like this one, I study the way that clusters of galaxies, the largest structures in the universe, evolve. These clusters of galaxies have masses up to 1,000,000 billion times the mass of the Sun. I study the way the collisions between galaxy clusters allow us to explore the properties of the diffuse gas between galaxies, and the role magnetic fields play. By combining observations from across the electromagnetic spectrum, from X-rays to the optical, we can see the full picture of the cosmos. I also study some of the most energetic phenomena in the universe, such as how supermassive black holes, like this one shown in the illustration, consume matter and how they can fire it back out again to control the way stars form in galaxies. These active galactic nuclei are key to understanding the properties of galaxies, as they blow gas away from the galaxies, stopping them from growing and preventing new stars from forming. I also work on helping new concepts for the next generation of X-ray telescopes, such as the Lynx X-ray Observatory, which is currently being considered by NASA for launch in the mid-2030s. These observatories will allow us to continue making transformative breakthroughs in high-energy astrophysics for decades to come.
Hello, I'm Dustin Roberts, and I am a PhD student at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, and I work in the nanophotonics labs. Today I'm going to show you something interesting in this fridge. Wait! These things are kind of expensive, and they have to stay cold. So first I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. What's in this fridge is something called quantum dots. Quantum dots are nanoscale semiconductor crystals. I know that sounds like a whole bunch of words just jumbled together, but they actually mean something. Nanoscale means that the size of these quantum dots is about 1/1000th of the width of a human hair. Semiconductor means that these things are made out of semiconducting material. I'm sure you've heard of silicon. That's probably the easiest example to remember. And crystal means that the atoms are packed together tightly in an ordered fashion. So imagine a chocolate chip cookie. If you have the chocolate chips scattered around on the cookie, you won't be able to get that many of them on there. But if you put them ordered next to each other very carefully, then you can get a lot more of them in there. That's essentially what a crystal is. Now this is actually a pretty good way to understand the basics of how quantum dots work. So as semiconductor crystals get smaller and smaller, they tend to emit at a single wavelength. As you can see, each of these quantum dots emits at a single wavelength. They're both made of the same material, and they emit at different wavelengths. This is because the wavelength actually depends on the size of the quantum dot, which is a purely quantum mechanical effect. Now let me go ahead and demonstrate how we actually find the emission of the quantum dot. In order to effectively demonstrate how we observe the emission of quantum dots, we start with a fairly high-powered light source. In our case, our light source is this laser, which emits at a wavelength of 514 nanometers, which is green. But before I turn it on, I need to make sure to put on these safety goggles. Now this laser goes across the table and hits these mirrors. Which directs the light from the laser to this microscope objective. The microscope objective focuses the laser onto our sample of quantum dots. As you can see, the light emitted by the quantum dots is clearly red. And as you remember, the light from our laser is green. That's because, as I explained to you earlier, as you make semiconductor crystals smaller and smaller, they tend to emit at only one wavelength. And that wavelength tends toward the red end of the visible spectrum. Now, different regions of the visible spectrum correspond to different wavelengths of light. The red end of the spectrum corresponds to longer wavelengths, and the blue spectrum corresponds to short wavelengths. All of you by now know you can actually separate the different colors or wavelengths out using devices such as a prism. And you measure the intensity of light at each one of those wavelengths, you can come up with what is called a spectrum of emission. And this technique is called spectroscopy. It's the same technique that NASA uses to determine the composition of stars. A spectrometer works kind of like the prism. So it separates all the different wavelengths, and then it measures the intensity of light at that specific wavelength. And we can use that to graph the emission spectra of the quantum dots. As you can see, there's a sharp peak here at about 650 nanometers. So we know the emission of the quantum dots occurs at 650 nanometers, which is in the red end of the spectrum, as we expect from what we see ourselves. You're probably asking yourself, why does all of this matter? What are these quantum dots actually going to do? Well, quantum dots are already being used in technologies such as television screens, and they make the screens more efficient. Another use for quantum dots is in biosensing, which means that biologists and chemists can use quantum dots to identify specific molecules within organisms. Other applications are lasers and improved solar cells. Hopefully I've taught you something with this video and inspired you to possibly attend UAH. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Lindsay Duan. I'm a professor here with the Department of Physics. And so this is my lab. So what you are seeing here is our laser lab. And in particular, this setup right here in front of you. And so this is a highly sensitive fiber optic interferometry experiment. That is going on here at the physics department. So let me tell you a little bit about what we're trying to do here. We're trying to make the world's most sensitive fiber optic sensor here. What's inside the box is essentially a fiber interferometer. Okay, it has two arms. Okay, and both are made of optical fibers, and each arm has a length roughly about 1 kilometer. Okay, and so these very long arms, okay, it can make the interferometer very, very sensitive. Okay. However, in order to build to test this kind of highly sensitive interferometers, you have to make sure your environment is very, very quiet. Because otherwise, what you see will be dominated by the noise, by the fluctuations from the surrounding environment. Okay. And so that's why you see the system. Okay. And it looks so complicated. You see all these wires, all these cables, and different layers of these boxes, and that's all. A lot of them are dedicated to isolate the sensor from the environment. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the details. So you see here, down here, okay, obviously everything is sitting on the optical table, and so down here we have a very sophisticated vibration isolation system. Okay, and so this system not only isolates vertical vibration, it can also isolate horizontal vibrations. Okay, and so that's the first step we want to do. Okay, the next step we want to do is we want to make sure the sensor is thermally isolated from the environment. Okay, inside this big box, actually there are several layers of boxes. Okay, and so the actual fiber interferometer is sitting in the very center of this box. Okay, now what's very interesting about what we're doing right now here is we're actually putting soil into this box. Okay, now you would think, okay, the highly sophisticated fiber optics experiment interferometry will have nothing to do with the soil, the garden soil that you would see in your backyard. However, we actually found out that the soil is one of the best things that can do the thermal isolation. Just think about it, if you ever walk into a basement, right? The basement, it doesn't matter what season you are in, the basement, it's constant temperature. That's because the basement is sitting underground, and underground, because you are surrounded by the soil, and the soil is a very good thermal isolation material. So we're making the world's first attempt to actually use soil to isolate the environment and do highly sensitive optical experiment. Okay. Now, obviously, inside the box, okay. Now we'll do some isolation, make the soil it doesn't contaminate the optics. Okay. And so, but there are layers, okay, on all the directions within the box. It's surrounded by about a 2-inch thick of garden soil. Okay. And then, so we have the output of from the sensor coming out, and all these fibers and the cables are supporting that system. Okay, and so the signal will send out to the instrument. Right now, it's sitting over there, and so shortly, my graduate student Nabil will tell you about the details of those signals.
Hi, this is Nabil. I'm a graduate student in physics department. I'm working on the same project what Dr. Duan just explained. So let me go through the experimental setup. So these are these instruments for taking the data for this project. So this is a conventional oscilloscope, so for monitoring the system. And in our setup, we are actually using 2 fabric cavity, which Dr. Duan just mentioned that we are actually mentioning those fabric cavity as a sensor. So we have 2 fabric cavity. We lock our laser frequency at the center of the peak of the fabric cavity with this blue rod box, and which is also evident from the yellow trace. So what the yellow trace corresponds to the transmitted intensity which is passing through the fabric cavity with locking, and for the green trace it shows the transmitted intensity which is passing through the second fabric cavity without locking. So the question is, without locking, how the laser is actually following the fluctuation of the resonance peak of the second fabric cavity. So the key point here is that we have 2 fabric cavity, and they are identical. So, and they are also placed under the same environment. So because of that, both of the fabric cavity will have similar fluctuation. So that's why when we first of all lock the laser frequency with the first fabric cavity, it will automatically follow the fluctuation of the second fabric cavity also. So that's why even without locking, we can see the transmitted intensity from the second fabric cavity, which is indicated by this green trace. Now our main goal of this experiment is to measure the ultimate thermal noise flow of the fiber optic sensor. So how do we do that? So right now we build up a magenta interferometer, so which has a 2 arm. So in one arm we place first fabric cavity, and in the second arm we place the second fabric cavity. And one of the arm is modulated with 50 megahertz. So we mix the 2 arms with a mixture, and the mixture output will contain that 50 megahertz signal, and which is actually indicated with this yellow trace here. So this is another oscilloscope. So this is actually the yellow trace is actually the mixture output which contains the 50 megahertz signal, and the blue trace correspond to the original driving 50 megahertz signal, and we will compare these two signals. So the key point here is that if the two 50 megahertz signal is exactly the same frequency, we will not see any drift between these two signals. But if we look at this oscilloscope signal, we can see there is a relative small drift between these two signals. So it means that there is a small frequency difference between these two signals, and that frequency difference is actually coming from the phase noise inside the fiber optic sensor. So basically the fiber optic sensor has the phase noise which is related to the frequency fluctuation here. And we can also measure that exact numerical frequency difference from this frequency counter instrument. So you can see that it's almost 49 megahertz. So that's the average frequency, and we can also see the frequency difference here. What is the frequency difference here? So basically we can measure the exact frequency difference from this instrument. And finally, we can also the spectrum, the phase noise spectrum from this spectrum analyzer. So this is how we measure the phase noise, the ultimate phase noise from these instruments. And if we you can see that there are lots of long wire. So I have to take the whole data in the other rooms, so that I will not introduce any additional noise in the fiber optic sensor. I think, yeah, that's it. Yeah. Thank you.